The year is 2015. You're sitting in a pub in Dublin, wrapped in the low amber glow of worn wooden tables and muted laughter. Outside, rain streaks the windows in long, familiar lines. Not dramatic, not romantic, just persistent. The kind of rain that doesn't announce itself, but never quite leaves. You cradle a pint of Guinness that cost you €6. You don't think much of it. Everything costs more now. You glance toward the street. Traffic crawls, buses hiss, apartments loom overhead. Most of them rented, many of them temporary. Your phone buzzes. A message from a friend. They're moving. Again, this time to Australia. Not because they want to. Because they have to. They've given up on buying a home in the town where they were born. This is Ireland in the mid-2010s. Crowded hospitals, endless housing queues. Young professionals living with roommates well into their 30s. A country that feels stretched. Then you open the news, and reality breaks. According to official government statistics, you are not living in a strained economy. You are living in an economic miracle. No more than that. The headlines are euphoric. Ireland's economy didn't just grow, it exploded. In a single year, the country posted 26.3% GDP growth. Let that number settle. 26.3%. This is not "we had a good year" growth. This is not exports are strong growth. This is the kind of number associated with post-war reconstruction or the discovery of vast natural resources. For context, at the absolute peak of China's industrial rise, when factories were erupting across entire provinces, growth barely crossed 10%. Yet Ireland had done more than double that. You look back up from your phone. The pub hasn't changed. The streets haven't changed. Your rent certainly hasn't gone down. There are no new factories humming outside the city. No mass hiring spree. No visible transformation. So the question forms quietly, then loudly. Where is the money? This is the moment where Ireland's modern economic story begins to unravel, because what you're looking at isn't prosperity. It's accounting. Economists struggled to describe what had just happened. The numbers were technically correct, legally valid, and completely detached from lived reality. One Nobel Prize-winning economist looked at the data, shook his head, and reached for a metaphor usually reserved for children's books. He called it Leprechaun Economics. Not as an insult, as a warning. Because the numbers belonged in a fairy tale. Ireland, it turned out, hadn't become richer. It had become something else entirely. A mirror, a pass-through. A legal fiction powerful enough to bend global statistics and fragile enough to collapse under scrutiny. To understand how this happened, you have to forget the image of Ireland as a small island nation punching above its weight through grit and innovation. That story did exist once, but this isn't that story. This is the story of how Ireland became the financial middleman for the world's largest corporations. How profits learned to teleport. How GDP stopped measuring production and started measuring paperwork. And how a nation quietly accepted a role that made it look wealthy while leaving its people increasingly poor. This didn't happen overnight. The roots stretch back decades to a time when Ireland was desperate. In the late 20th century, Ireland was not a success story. It was exporting people, not products. Emigration was a rite of passage. Debt was high. Jobs were scarce. Policymakers knew they needed foreign capital badly. So they made a choice. If Ireland couldn't compete on scale or resources, it would compete on rules. Low corporate taxes became the headline, but taxes were only the surface. Beneath them sat something far more powerful, a legal system flexible enough to allow multinational corporations to exist everywhere and nowhere at once. This is where the illusion began. Because in the modern global economy, value no longer needs to stay where it's created. It can be moved, shifted, reclassified. A product sold in Paris can become income in Dublin. A patent developed in California can suddenly live on a balance sheet in Ireland. And once value is defined as intellectual property rather than physical production, borders become suggestions. Ireland didn't invent this system, but it perfected it. By the early 2000s, corporate lawyers had turned Ireland into a keystone of global profit shifting. American tech giants, companies selling phones, software, ads, and data across Europe discovered they could route enormous profits through Irish entities without triggering meaningful taxation anywhere. To the outside world, it looked like Ireland was booming. Capital flooded in. GDP surged. Investment statistics went vertical. But beneath the surface, something strange was happening. Ireland wasn't producing vastly more goods. It wasn't consuming vastly more services. It wasn't even employing vastly more people. What it was doing was hosting profits briefly, before they vanished again. This is the core contradiction of the Irish miracle. Economic textbooks tell us that GDP growth should correlate with rising living standards. Better infrastructure, better services, better lives. But in Ireland, the link snapped. Growth became detached from experience. And when the numbers finally grew too absurd to ignore, when GDP jumped by over a quarter in a single year without a single visible transformation, even the institutions tasked with measuring the economy had to admit something was wrong. Ireland's central bank quietly stopped using GDP as a meaningful indicator. They created a new metric instead. A metric that removed multinational distortions, that stripped away the legal ghosts, that attempted, desperately, to answer a simple question: what does the Irish economy actually look like without the illusion? When they did, the economy shrank by nearly 40%. This is not a rounding error. This is the difference between reality and narrative. And the narrative was profitable. Because as long as Ireland looked rich, it paid the price of richness. Higher contributions to European budgets, political expectations it couldn't meet, and a dependency on corporations whose loyalty extended only as far as the next loophole. Ireland had built an economy that worked brilliantly as long as nothing changed. But the world was changing. And the first crack in the illusion was about to appear, hidden inside a structure with a name that sounded like a joke, but moved hundreds of billions of dollars. A structure so elegant, so legally precise, and so morally hollow that it became the foundation of modern profit shifting. It was called the double Irish with a Dutch sandwich. And once you understand it, you'll never look at GDP the same way again. If the phrase double Irish with a Dutch sandwich sounds like something ordered at a pub after midnight, that's fitting. Because like most late-night decisions, it delivered short-term pleasure and long-term consequences. Only this time, the hangover was measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. This was not a loophole discovered by accident. It was engineered, refined, defended, and for decades, it formed the backbone of Ireland's phantom prosperity. To understand it, you need to step inside a corporate boardroom in the early 2000s. The room is quiet, glass-walled, overlooking California sunshine. On the whiteboard are arrows, boxes, country names. The problem is simple. Profits are global, but taxes are national, and taxes, to the modern multinational, are friction. So the question becomes, how do you sell products everywhere, but pay taxes nowhere? The answer begins with Ireland. At the time, Irish law defined corporate tax residence not by where a company was incorporated, but by where it was managed and controlled. That single phrase cracked the door open. Layer 1. The first Irish company. You incorporate a subsidiary in Ireland. It has an Irish address, Irish registration, and an Irish name. But you ensure its board meetings take place somewhere else. Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, anywhere warm and discreet. Under Irish law, this company is not tax resident in Ireland. Under U.S. law, it is foreign. It becomes a legal ghost. Stateless, untouchable. Layer 2. The Dutch slice. You can't move money directly from Ireland to a Caribbean tax haven without triggering taxes. But European Union law offers a solution. Royalty payments between EU member states can flow freely. So you create a Dutch company, a mailbox with a bank account. It exists to receive money and pass it along. Nothing more. Layer 3. The second Irish company. This one is real. It employs people. It sells products across Europe. When someone in Paris buys a phone for $1,000, this company records the sale. On paper, it looks wildly profitable. But then comes the trick. This operating company doesn't own the brand. It doesn't own the patents. It doesn't own the software. For the right to use those assets, it must pay enormous royalties to the first Irish company, the Ghost One. Those royalties wipe out nearly all its profits. So, despite massive revenues, it pays almost no tax in Ireland. The money flows next to the Dutch company, which immediately forwards it to the first Irish entity controlled offshore. Thanks to treaties and definitions, no tax is triggered at any stage. The final destination, 0%. This was not theory. It was practice. Google used it. Microsoft used it. Facebook used it. But the undisputed master of this architecture was Apple. By the early 2010s, Apple's Irish subsidiaries were booking staggering amounts of profit. In some years, tens of billions of dollars flowed through entities with no employees, no factories, and no meaningful presence beyond a legal address. Eventually, the scale became impossible to ignore. In 2016, after years of pressure, the European Commission launched a formal investigation. What they found detonated across the global financial press. One Apple subsidiary in Ireland had paid an effective tax rate of 0.005%. Read that again. Not 0.5%, not 0.0005%. 0.005. If a normal worker paid taxes at that rate on a $50,000 salary, they'd owe less than the price of a coffee. Apple, meanwhile, was shifting profits larger than the GDP of some countries. The ruling concluded that Ireland had granted illegal state aid, that Apple owed back taxes. Ireland, remarkably, fought the ruling not because it disagreed with the math, but because enforcing it threatened the entire model. This was the moment when the illusion reached its peak. Because as international pressure mounted, these schemes began to close. The double Irish was phased out. The sandwich was unwrapped. So what did the corporations do? They moved the gold, not physically, legally. Instead of parking intellectual property offshore, they onshored it into Ireland. Patents, trademarks, software rights, all transferred onto Irish balance sheets. Overnight, Ireland appeared to acquire vast capital assets. Trillions in value materialized on paper. GDP surged by 26.3%. No factories were built. No workers were hired. No new industries emerged. A spreadsheet changed. An economist looked at the data and named it what it was: Leprechaun Economics, a pot of gold that vanishes when you try to touch it. But this wasn't just an academic joke. It had consequences. Ireland suddenly looked far richer than it was. That meant higher contributions to European budgets, skewed fiscal planning, broken economic indicators, policymakers trying to steer an economy using instruments that no longer reflected reality. It was like flying a plane where the altimeter says you're in orbit, while the trees outside the cockpit are getting closer. Eventually, the distortion became so extreme that Ireland's own statisticians gave up on GDP altogether. They created a new measure, modified gross national income, stripping out multinational effects just to understand what was actually happening inside the country. And when they did, the truth emerged. The real Irish economy was far smaller, far weaker, far more fragile. GDP hadn't measured growth. It had measured transit. Money passing through, not staying, not building, not lifting living standards. Ireland had become a toll booth on the global highway of capital. And this was only the first layer. Because once you understand how profits move without substance, the next illusion reveals itself. One that doesn't just distort numbers, but quietly reshapes societies. It's called phantom foreign direct investment. And it turns entire office buildings into ghosts. Imagine walking down a quiet street in Dublin's Docklands. Glass, steel, cafes on the corner. Nothing remarkable. Then you look up a single, unassuming office building in the corporate registry. Inside this 5-story structure are 200 companies. On paper, they control tens of billions of dollars in assets. In reality, there are no traders shouting into headsets. No engineers debugging code. No factory floors humming with machinery. There's a receptionist, a filing cabinet, a brass plaque on the wall. This is the next layer of Ireland's illusion: phantom foreign direct investment. In economic textbooks, foreign direct investment means something tangible. A company builds a factory. It hires local workers. It transfers skills and technology. Real capital arrives, and something physical is created. But phantom FDI is different. Phantom FDI is money that enters a country only to pass through it. It creates no jobs, builds no infrastructure, adds no productive capacity. It exists purely to lower a tax bill somewhere else. and Ireland became one of the largest parking lots for this kind of money on Earth. A landmark study by the IMF and researchers from the University of Copenhagen shattered a long-held assumption that global investment statistics reflected real economic activity. Their conclusion was staggering. Around 40% of all global foreign direct investment is phantom, special-purpose vehicles and legal constructs with no connection to the real economy. And Ireland, with a population of 5 million, sits at the center of it. At one point, U.S. companies had more investment parked in Ireland than in China, India, Russia, and Brazil combined. Read that again. Ireland is smaller than South Carolina. The others are home to billions of people. Yet, on paper, American capital preferred Dublin. Of course, it wasn't investing in Ireland. It was investing through Ireland. This is where the story turns darker. Because phantom investment doesn't just distort statistics, it reshapes power. Ireland's legal framework includes a structure known as Section 110 companies, originally designed to help manage complex financial assets. They became a tool of extraction after the 2008 financial crisis. Here's how it played out. The crash hits, property values collapse. Mortgages fail. Irish banks, drowning in bad loans, sell distressed mortgages to international funds. These funds, often American hedge funds or so-called vulture funds, acquire Irish homes at deep discounts. They do it through Section 110 entities. These entities pursue borrowers aggressively. Miss a payment, fall behind. Lose your job, the pressure escalates. Families lose homes. Communities fracture. And the profits. Thanks to the structure, these companies pay virtually no tax in Ireland. So, the state loses revenue. Citizens lose housing. And the gains flow back to global capital, legally, efficiently, invisibly. This is the human cost of phantom FDI. It's a system where capital enjoys rights without responsibility, while citizens absorb the risk. And it doesn't stop with housing. Once you accept that value can exist without presence, the next step is even more abstract: producing exports without producing anything. Welcome to the dropshipping nation. You know the model. A teenager sets up an online store. You buy a product. It ships directly from a factory in another country. The seller never touches it. Now scale that up to $1 trillion corporation. In Ireland's case, this practice is called contract manufacturing. And it is one of the single largest distorters of Irish trade statistics. Here's the mechanism. An Irish subsidiary owns the intellectual property for a product, a phone, a drug, a medical device. The physical manufacturing happens somewhere else: China, Singapore, Eastern Europe. The product ships directly from the factory to the customer in Germany, France, or Italy. But because the Irish entity owns the IP, the sale is recorded as an Irish export, even though the product never entered Ireland, even though Irish workers never touched it, even though no physical value was created on Irish soil. The result? Ireland appears to be one of the world's largest exporters of pharmaceuticals and technology. On paper, its trade surplus is enormous, the kind of surplus usually associated with industrial powerhouses. But this surplus is hollow. The money from those exports doesn't circulate locally. It doesn't raise wages. It doesn't expand services. It flows straight back out as royalties and dividends. It's like holding a suitcase of cash for someone else at an airport. For a brief moment, it looks like you're rich. Try to spend it, and the illusion collapses. This is why GDP becomes meaningless. In most countries, GDP approximates economic reality. In Ireland, it measures the volume of transactions passing through legal entities. So economists use another measure: modified gross national income. When you switch from GDP to this metric, Ireland's economy shrinks by roughly 40%. That gap is the illusion, the hologram versus the object. And this pattern, massive assets, minimal employment, extreme exposure to global shocks, appears again in one final sector that perfectly captures the fragility of Ireland's model: the sky itself. Because even the airplanes above you may not be what they seem. Here's a fact that sounds fake until you check it twice. More than 60% of all leased commercial aircraft in the world are managed from Ireland. If you board a plane, American, European, Middle Eastern, there is a better than even chance that the aircraft is technically Irish, not built in Ireland. Not flown by Ireland. Owned, leased, and depreciated through Ireland. This part of the story didn't begin as a trick. It began with competence. In the 1970s, an Irish entrepreneur named Tony Ryan recognized something airlines hated: owning planes. Aircraft are expensive, capital-intensive assets that lose value over time. Ryan saw an opportunity. He built a business buying planes and leasing them to airlines that didn't want the balance sheet burden. It was smart, efficient, useful. Ireland developed real expertise in aviation finance. Lawyers, accountants, insurers, an entire ecosystem formed around leasing metal that flew across borders. Then, as always, the tax engineers arrived. Ireland's depreciation rules for aircraft were generous, extremely generous. Planes could be written down quickly, slashing taxable income. Leasing firms multiplied. Special purpose vehicles appeared, often one company per plane, each designed to minimize tax exposure. On paper, Ireland's capital stock ballooned. Hundreds of billions in assets sat on balance sheets, but employment didn't scale. Risk did, because when assets exist everywhere, they are exposed to everything. That reality hit hard in February 2022. Russia invaded Ukraine. The world fractured overnight. Sanctions slammed into place. And suddenly, Irish leasing companies realized they had a problem. Hundreds of aircraft worth billions were sitting on runways in Moscow and St. Petersburg, leased to Russian airlines like Aeroflot. Contracts were canceled, requests were made, planes were demanded back. The answer, effectively, was no. Russia re-registered the aircraft domestically. Insurance claims exploded. Legal battles erupted across jurisdictions. Planes vanished from Irish balance sheets, not physically destroyed, but politically unreachable. It was one of the largest insurance disputes in history, and it exposed something crucial. Ireland's economy was holding massive global risk without controlling global outcomes. The aviation sector became a perfect microcosm of the broader system. Enormous assets on paper, minimal employment relative to value. Extreme sensitivity to geopolitical shocks, and a tax bill that rarely matched the scale of exposure. Ireland owned the sky until the sky pushed back. And while corporations played legal chess with patents and airplanes, something else was happening below. The people living inside this economy were falling behind. This is the great contradiction at the heart of Leprechaun Economics. Ireland ranks near the top of Europe by GDP per capita. On paper, it is one of the richest countries on the continent, rivaled only by microstates and financial hubs like Luxembourg. But economists have another metric, one that strips away corporate illusions and focuses on humans. It's called actual individual consumption. AIC measures what people can actually afford: housing, food, healthcare, transport. It's a proxy for lived standard of living. And here, Ireland collapses. When ranked by AIC, Ireland falls below the EU average, below countries that look poorer on paper, below nations with far less economic growth. So where did the money go? Into rent. Picture a young professional in Dublin. They work for a global tech firm. The salary looks good on paper, $60,000 a year. Respectable. Then they look for housing. A studio apartment costs $2,000 a month. Viewings resemble job interviews. 50 people line the street. Inside, the apartment is barely larger than the kitchen. You can reach the stove from the bed. This isn't an exaggeration. It's the market. The same funds that mastered phantom investment and tax minimization are now buying housing in bulk. Entire apartment blocks acquired by global investors, often through the same legal structures that pay little to no tax on rental income. Because these funds face lower effective taxes, they can outbid local families. They don't need to break even quickly. They don't live there. The result is a closed loop. Irish workers earn wages. They pay rent to foreign funds. The funds move profits offshore. The state collects less tax. GDP rises, lives shrink. Ireland becomes a funnel, channeling labor income upward and outward, while celebrating growth statistics that never return. And the state, dependent on multinational revenue, hesitates to intervene too forcefully. This dependence extends beyond tax. It reaches into regulation. Under European law, tech companies with their European headquarters in Dublin are primarily regulated by the Irish Data Protection Commission. This one-stop shop means privacy complaints from across Europe funnel into a single national authority. For years, critics argued the regulator moved slowly, cautiously, reluctantly. Why wouldn't it? Ireland's corporate tax windfall depends on these companies staying. Regulating them aggressively risks scaring away the golden geese. The conflict of interest is structural. It took pressure from Brussels and legal challenges led by activists for larger fines to finally land. And even then, enforcement often arrived years late. The message was clear. Ireland didn't just sell low taxes. It sold low friction. But friction, like gravity, exists for a reason. Because when growth depends on a handful of corporations, the system becomes brittle. By the early 2020s, over half of all corporate tax revenue in Ireland came from just 10 companies. 10. If one CEO changes strategy, if intellectual property moves, if structures shift, if global rules tighten, the consequences are immediate. Irish fiscal watchdogs began issuing warnings. This money, they said, is a windfall. Don't treat it as permanent. Don't fund permanent spending with temporary luck. It's like winning the lottery every year and assuming the numbers will always hit. Ireland listened. And didn't. Because stepping off the tiger is harder than riding it. And now, the walls are closing in. The global tax system is changing. Minimum rates, shared enforcement, fewer hiding places. The illusion that began as a clever workaround is hardening into a national dependency. And that leads us to the final question. What happens when the magic runs out? Every economic model works until it doesn't. For Ireland, the moment of reckoning didn't arrive with a crash or a collapse. It arrived quietly, in meeting rooms and international agreements, buried inside policy language that sounded harmless. A number, 15%. In 2021, after years of negotiation, pressure, and quiet panic inside finance ministries, over 140 countries agreed to a global minimum corporate tax rate. The goal was simple in theory: stop the race to the bottom, make profits shifting less profitable, force multinationals to pay something, somewhere. Ireland resisted. For decades, its 12.5% rate had been sacred, not just a policy, but an identity. Eventually, Ireland agreed to the deal, but only partially. Smaller firms could keep the old rate. The giants, the Apples, Googles, Metas of the world would pay 15%. On paper, this should have spelled disaster. In reality, something stranger happened. Ireland's corporate tax revenues surged. In 2022 and 2023, the government collected so much money it didn't know what to do with it. Budget surpluses appeared. Emergency funds were created. Politicians spoke of opportunity. But beneath the celebration, the warnings grew louder. Over 50% of all corporate tax revenue now comes from just 10 companies. 10 executives, 10 boardrooms, 10 strategic decisions made thousands of miles away. This is not diversification. This is concentration risk. Ireland's own Fiscal Advisory Council, the institutional voice of caution, has been blunt. This revenue, they say, is not permanent. It is volatile. It is conditional. It can disappear as quickly as it arrived. Spend it on long-term commitments, and the state risks disaster when the tap shuts off. This is the final paradox of Leprechaun Economics. The model has made Ireland rich enough to fear losing its wealth, but not secure enough to live comfortably with it. The country has become dependent on capital that does not belong to it, profits it does not control, and companies it cannot afford to offend. Ireland didn't merely attract multinational corporations. It reorganized itself around them, and that is the trap. Because once your economy is built to serve global capital, exiting that role is not a policy decision. It's a structural surgery. Factories can be built elsewhere. Intellectual property can be reassigned. Legal entities can be dissolved with signatures. The loyalty of capital is procedural, not emotional. Ireland rode the tiger and now cannot dismount without being mauled. What began as a statistical oddity hardened into an addiction. And like all addictions, the pain is not in the high, it's in the withdrawal. The deeper lesson here isn't about Ireland. It's about the modern global economy itself. We've learned that profits can be stateless, that investment doesn't require construction, that exports can exist without production, that assets can vanish behind sanctions and borders. We've learned that GDP can grow while society fractures. Ireland is not an outlier. It is a preview. A warning signal flashing inside the balance sheets of late-stage capitalism. A system where nations compete not to build, but to host. Where citizens become collateral in regulatory arbitrage. Where success is measured in spreadsheets, not stability. The fairy tale worked for a while, but fairy tales always end when you wake up. And the next time you hear a politician celebrate record GDP growth, remember the leprechaun. Remember that numbers are stories we tell ourselves, and stories can lie. A rising tide lifts all boats, they say, but only if you own a boat. If you're swimming, the tide just pulls you under faster. Ireland shows us that you can have the best balance sheet in Europe and still struggle to house your people. That you can host the world's wealth and still feel poor at home. That you can win the game and still lose the point. It is a country of paper riches and real anxiety, of global power and local precarity, of friendly pubs beneath a system that never stops extracting. The most successful tax haven in the world, disguised as a rainy island with good butter and better manners. And the question now isn't whether the model will change, it's who pays when it does. Because if the last decade taught us anything, it's this. When illusions collapse, they don't disappear. They fall on people.